Hey guys, tonight we begin with the smell of biscuits and old gunpowder, drifting through swinging doors that never quite closed. The kind of smell that clings to wood and coats your tongue before you even sit down. It's not sweet. It's not clean. But it's familiar. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Tonight, we're not chasing outlaws or mining for gold. We're listening instead to the scrape of a spoon in a tin bowl, the crackle of grease in a crooked pan, the heavy silence between bites. This isn't the Wild West of movies. It's the quiet, crumb-filled reality that came after the horses were stabled and the guns were hung up for the night, because long after the dust had settled and the fires burned low, people still needed to eat. And they ate what they could not, what they wanted. Meals were made from whatever lasted, whatever could be salted, boiled, or forgotten about until it softened enough to swallow. There was no menu. There were no guarantees. Just a line of men hoping for warmth, and a cook back there somewhere stirring something that smelled almost edible, will drift past swinging saloon doors and into rooms that echo with boots, spittoons, and the clink of chipped plates. We'll sit down at long, sticky tables where names were rarely exchanged, but meals were. We'll meet the beans, the biscuits, the meat that no one named, and the cooks who made do, with hands burned and sleeves too short, muttering to themselves. As they stirred, this story isn't fast. It's not loud. It's about the comfort of something hot on a cold night. The dignity in a plate that doesn't taste good, but fills you anyway, and so, with the scent of old stew lingering in the air, let's step inside. The first sign of evening wasn't the sunset. It was the clatter of boots outside the saloon door, the slow hush of wind as it slid between planks of warped wood. Somewhere, a bell jingled not because it was meant to, but because it hung by a bent nail that wobbled when the wind sighed to hard. The air smelled of dust, sweat, and horse. But beneath it, faint and familiar, was something warmer. Something. Cooking. Or trying to. It wasn't much. Not enough to make mouths water. Just enough to make them stop drying out. Beans, probably. A stew thickened by time and whatever had been left from the morning pot. No one asked what was in it. Asking was for places with menus. This was not that kind of place. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Outside, the day was still alive barely. But in here, in this dim little corner of the world, the day had already slipped into hunger. Not the sharp kind, but the dull ache that had lived in men's bellies so long they'd stopped noticing it. You didn't walk into a saloon hoping for food. You walked in hoping for something hot. And if it came in a bowl, even better. The floors were never clean. The chairs never even. Tables leaned like tired shoulders. But there was always one thing that worked, the stove. It hissed, sputtered, threatened to give up, but it kept going. A little like the men who sat nearby, warming, their hands with their sleeves pulled down too long. Dinner didn't come on plates here. It came in dense tin bowls or heavy mugs, often passed from one hand to another without looking. You ate what the cook made, and the cook made what the town hadn't yet run out of. Tonight, it might be salt pork boiled, so long it gave up its shape, or corn mush, stiff as a saddlebag. Or maybe if luck had knocked politely at the back door, there'd be stew. The kind that looked the same every night, but never quite tasted the same. You didn't ask what was in it. You didn't want to know the cook. No one knew his name. He might have had one once, but now he was just him, the man behind the curtain of steam, always stirring, never smiling. His apron was a map of stains. His sleeves were rolled past elbows that had seen more grease than sunshine. Sometimes he muttered. Sometimes he hummed. But he never stopped moving. He wasn't cooking for joy. He was cooking because people were hungry, and that was reason enough. Sometimes a man came in too late and got the crust, the burned part clinging to the edge of the pot. It tasted bitter and soft at once, like chewing a boot soaked in memory. But he ate it anyway, grateful. Quiet, because in towns like this, silence was the only tip a cook ever expected. Some brought their own spoons, bent and shiny from years of scraping tins. Others used whatever the saloon offered if anything was left. But no one complained. Complaining took energy, and most had spent that walking here. There was a rhythm to the eating, a kind of peace. Spoons tapping, elbows close, eyes focused downward or on nothing at all. Conversations, if they happened, were soft. A comment on the weather, a grunt about a lost horse, maybe a whisper about someone who hadn't come back yet, but never about the food. The food wasn't for talking. It was for stopping the emptiness, just long enough to get to tomorrow. And the dust, it always settled in before the meal ended. You could see it in the light from the oil lamp, a soft golden snowfall over the tables. Some would brush it off their sleeves. Others didn't notice. The dust came with the land. It came with the roads. And it came with the kind of hunger that wasn't just in your stomach, but in your bones. Dinner was over when the bowls were empty, or when the silence got too heavy to hold. Some would stay, nursing the last bite like a prayer. Others slipped out without a word, their boots whispering against the floorboards. No one said goodnight. They just vanished, back into the cold or the quiet or the dark. And the cook, he kept stirring, preparing for a breakfast no one would enjoy, but everyone would show up for, because food in the Wild West wasn't about taste. It was about timing. If you arrived before the pot ran dry, you were lucky. If not, you waited, not for better food, just for the same food later. And somehow, that was enough. The beans were always there. They didn't announce themselves. They didn't boast. They just existed. A quiet constant in a place where nothing else ever stayed the same. People came and went. Horses aged and died. But the beans never left, dry at first, hard little stones poured from a burlap sack. Then soaked, swollen, boiled down into something that could be swallowed without cracking a tooth. And no one loved the beans. But they were hard to hate too. They filled the pot. They filled the belly, and sometimes that was all the comfort anyone could afford. There was a kind of ritual to them. They'd start simmering in the morning, long before the saloon was filled with men. A big iron pot set over firewood that crackled and hissed as if it resented the work. The smell was familiar, but never quite kind earthy, faintly sour, sometimes sweet when someone dropped in molasses just to see if it helped. It didn't. Not really. By midday, the beans were thick. Not elegant thick, just heavy. Lumpy. Like they were growing bored of being stirred. And beside them, the biscuits, hard, pale, round as regret. They were called hardtack by some, cowboy cookies by others. But mostly they were just called these again. They didn't crumble. They cracked, broke open with a dull sound, like stepping on a bone buried in sand. If you soaked them long enough in bean juice, they softened slightly. If you had no patience, you chewed and hoped your teeth were stronger than your memories. Still, no one left them behind. Even a bad biscuit was a biscuit. And in the West, where hunger was quieter than thirst but deeper, a biscuit meant survival. Sometimes someone would joke that the biscuits could stop a bullet. But when your ribs stuck out and your boots had holes, a biscuit was better than armor. They were made with flour that had crossed states in wagons, with lard that might have turned already, with water fetched from somewhere you hoped no horses had stepped in. And yet, the saloon cook slapped the dough together like he was building a wall, one biscuit at a time, flat round, lined up on a dented tray and baked until they resembled memories of bread there was no butter. Not unless someone rich passed through. Not unless someone died and left behind a can of something yellow and forgotten. Most days, you just ate them plain. The cook, if he was feeling generous, might give you two. If he was feeling tired, just one. And no one asked for more. They didn't say thank you either. Gratitude was silent. A nod. A quiet chewing with your back to the wall. Once a man came in fresh from the east. Fancy hat, shiny boots, money that still smelled like polish. He took one look at the beans and laughed. Said they looked like animal feed. Said he'd never eaten something that brown. The room went still. And no one said anything. But the cook handed him a bowl anyway. A biscuit, too. And when the man sat down and took his first bite, he kept chewing. Then he kept eating. And when he left the next morning, he said nothing at all because the beans weren't for taste. They were for staying alive. Some days they came with scraps of bacon, if someone had traded well, or the pigs had been generous. Other times there'd be a slice of onion floating in the pot, soft and translucent like a ghost that once had flavor. On rare, whispered days, someone said they saw meat. No one believed them. Most didn't even look anymore. Just ate, swallowed, breathed, repeated. There was something comforting in the repetition. In knowing what the food would be, even if you didn't want it. And knowing that tomorrow's beans would taste like yesterday's, and that was oddly soothing. Because in a world where your horse might disappear and your name might be forgotten, the beans never changed. The biscuits would be lined up near the stove, growing staler by the hour. But it didn't matter. Heat made everything seem fresher. And a warm biscuit, even one that tasted like old saddle, was still warmth. At tea night, when the saloon had emptied, and only the flickering oil lamp remained, the last bowl of beans sat cooling on the counter, forgotten by someone too tired or too drunk to finish it, and the cook, sleeves rolled, fingers burned, would look at it for a long while. Sometimes he'd eat it. Sometimes he wouldn't. Sometimes he'd just scrape it into the fire. Not out of waste. Just to watch the embers hiss, because even he grew tired of the beans, but he knew. Tomorrow would come. The pot would be refilled. The biscuits rolled and baked again, not because anyone loved them, but because they were what people expected, and in the Wild West, expectation was as close to hope as most ever got. There were nights when the pot didn't smell like beans. It smelled different. Not better, not worse, just different, sharper, a little oily, a little gamey. The kind of smell that made you pause your breath before leaning in. That's when you knew. Tonight was stew, but not the kind they wrote about in books or served with silver spoons. This was Wild West stew. And what was in it? Well, that depended on the day, or the roadkill, or the luck. The locals called it mystery meat, though no one said it out loud. You didn't want to name it, because the truth was, it could be anything. Raccoon, squirrel, old goat, new dog. The West didn't offer many rules. Just one. If it had bones and could be boiled, it could be served. The meat was always chopped small. That was part of the disguise. Little pieces floating in a thick brown liquid with herbs that weren't really herbs, just weeds someone crushed and hoped might help. And they did, kind of. At least it made the stew smell less like fur The broth had depth. The kind of depth that came from long, slow hours, or from bones that boiled until they fell apart in silence. No one questioned it. They just dipped bread, chewed slowly, and avoided eye contact with whatever floated too long. Sometimes the meat was soft and fell apart on your tongue. Sometimes it had tendons that fought back. Once in a while, there'd be a crunch too soft to be bone, too hard to ignore. You'd pause, swallow, move on. That's how it was, because food wasn't for joy. It was for fuel. And stew, even bad stew, was warm. It lingered in your chest. It sat heavy in your belly. It gave you enough energy to survive another cold night. Beneath thin blankets and thin stars, the cook never said what he used. He didn't need to. He just stirred, added water, stirred again. If he found meat, it went in. If he didn't, well, sometimes the stew didn't have any, but he always served it the same way. 2 ladles, heavy, steaming. A thick slice of hard bread on the side. A look that said, "This is what there is." No one complained. No one asked for salt. There wasn't any. Men ate with sleeves rolled high and heads bowed low. The stew made them quiet, focused. It was hard to speak with something this heavy in your mouth. The saloon didn't have many spoons. Some used forks. Some used knives. Some used fingers. A man once tried to count how many times the meat changed flavor. He gave up after 3 bites. It didn't matter, he said. It's all the same in the dark, and it was true. By lamplight, the stew glowed in a way that made it look almost delicious. Steam curling upward, dancing in the amber light like it had something to say. No one listened. Sometimes late at night, you could hear the cook muttering as he stirred. Counting, maybe. Or remembering. Or just talking to the meat, asking it to hold together for one more bowl. The pot itself had character. Blackened on the bottom, bent at the rim. It had fed more people than the town preacher. And unlike the preacher, it never lied. You never knew how old the meat was. That was part of the adventure. Left too long, it turned sour, but the cook had a way of masking it. A bit more pepper, a splash of last week's whiskey, or just boiling it until the memory of flavor faded into something neutral. Once, a traveling doctor stopped in and asked what kind of meat was used. The cook just stared at him. Hot, he said. That was enough, and the doctor didn't ask again. The stew never lasted long. A big pot, a big ladle, a room full of hungry people. It was gone before it had time to cool. And when it was, men sat back in their chairs, rubbed their stomachs, and tried not to think too hard. The strange thing was, sometimes it was good, not delicious, not joyful, but good enough to make you hum under your breath as you ate. Good enough to bring back some memory of your mother's kitchen long ago, before you came west and traded hope for land. A tea didn't happen often, but when it did, the whole saloon felt it. A hush, a stillness, as if for one moment the stew had become more than meat and water. It had become comfort, and when the bowls were scraped clean and the last bit of broth had been sopped up with crust, the cook would lower the flame, wipe his hands on a cloth too dirty to help, and exhale. He never smiled, but he stood a little straighter, because no matter what, it had been possum, pigeon, pork from a can, it had filled the bellies of tired men, and in a town where survival was the only success story worth telling, that was enough. The mornings didn't start with a rooster. They started with a rattle metal against metal, followed by a groan from the fire as it stretched into the day. And then came the smell. Burnt, bitter, sharp enough to sting the nose, and rouse a man from even the deepest hangover coffee. If that's what you could call it. It wasn't brewed. It was boiled angrily, in a blackened kettle that had known more campfires than kitchens. The grounds were dumped in without care, followed by water that was never clean and never cold. Then it was left to bubble, not steep, boil. The result? A drink so thick you didn't sip it. You braced for it. You chewed. Sometimes it crunched. There was no sugar, no cream, no hope of flavor, just heat and grit. And the kind of strength that came not from caffeine, but from defiance. No one asked where the beans came from. They came in burlap sacks, hard as gravel, probably traded off a wagon 2 months late. Some had mold. Most had character. The cook or whoever had been left in charge of the morning would ladle it straight from the pot into dented mugs. Sometimes tin. Sometimes old ceramic with chips that turned your lip red if you weren't careful. And the men? They took it like medicine. One sip, one wince. Eyes narrowed. Throats cleared. And then silence, because even bad coffee meant the day had begun. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. It was strongest when you didn't look at it. Just held it in both hands, let the heat slip into your fingers, and let the steam fog your lashes. It didn't wake you up gently. It shook you by the collar, but you welcomed the shake. It meant you were still alive, still here, still west of somewhere. There were rumors, of course. That one saloon downriver served real coffee, with eggs on the side, with bread that didn't crumble like plaster, but no one ever found that saloon. And if they did, they never came back. Maybe they were lying, or maybe they stayed. The grounds didn't stay at the bottom. They floated, danced, clung to the rim like they had something left to say. By the last sip, it was less drink and more sediment. But no one ever poured it out. That would be wasteful. A man once tossed the dregs, and the cook chased him out with a ladle. Said those dregs were the best part. Said they kept your teeth strong. He might have been joking. Might not. It didn't matter. Next time, the man drank every drop. Some tried straining it through cloth. Others stirred it until it dissolved. A few just embraced the chew. Coffee like that wasn't about taste. It was about grit. In the grounds. In the throat. In the soul. The regulars didn't even flinch anymore. They'd take their mug to the window, lean on the sill, and sip like it was tea in a parlor, staring out at nothing, watching dust rise, listening to the town creak, and that was the beauty of it. This awful, necessary thing, because it gave them a moment, a ritual, a pause between waking and walking. In a life where nothing was guaranteed. Not your horse, not your job, not even your name. Coffee was dependable. Ugly but dependable. Sometimes a man would sit alone at the bar, mug in hand, eyes unfocused, not drinking, just holding. Because sometimes the weight of a hot mug was the only warmth his fingers would feel all day, and sometimes the cook would add something to it. Whiskey if the night had been long. Butter if the cow hadn't kicked over the churn. Molasses once, but that made it worse somehow. A few tried importing fancy beans. Didn't last. The West didn't care for luxury. It cared for fire, for function, for something that could wake you up without saying a word. The smell of it drifted through floorboards and saddle blankets. Woke up dogs, annoyed horses, made the entire saloon feel less empty, even if the mugs chipped. Even if the heat scalded your tongue, even if the last sip always tasted like soil. Still, they drank it because there are some things that feel like home, even if they hurt. A mother's scolding, a boot's pinch, coffee that bites, and when the pot was empty and the silence too thick to stir, the cook would scrape the bottom, clean, set it aside, and wait for the next morning, for the next boil, for the next round of men too tired to speak, but too stubborn to sleep, because in the Wild West, coffee wasn't about waking up. It was about staying awake. One bitter sip at a time, there were two things you could count on in a frontier saloon. When the sky turned orange and your boots still hadn't cooled from the sun, a pour of something sharp enough to blind you, and a slab of something salty enough to survive the winter, whiskey and salt pork. Not a pairing, a lifeline. Neither was kind, but both were consistent. The whiskey came first, not because it was welcome, but because it was easy. Easier to pour than to explain. Easier to drink than to think. It burned. Not in the chest, but in the eyes. You could smell it across the room, sloshed from a chipped bottle into thick glasses that were never really clean. Amber, brown, sometimes green at the edge. It tasted like firewood and metal, like something that had tried to be alcohol, but gave up halfway, but no one complained because it was warm. And warmth in a cold, cracked life wasn't something you questioned. Some said it was made from corn. Others swore it was kerosene. A few believed it had once been medicine, but most didn't ask. They just took it down in one motion, let it burn through the silence in their throat, and sat back with a sigh they hadn't earned, but needed. Salt pork came after, or with it, or instead of it, depending on the cook's mood and the wagon's timing. Thick, white slabs with streaks of meat hiding like secrets in fat, cut with a dull knife, fried in pans that had seen too many winters. Grease popped like applause in the pan, filling the room with a smell that made you question hunger because it didn't smell good. It smelled familiar, like boots after rain, like blankets that never dried. Like every morning before this one, if you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Salt pork wasn't tender. It wasn't juicy. It was work. You had to chew and keep chewing until your jaw forgot what comfort felt like, but it stayed with you. In your stomach, in your beard, in the air. And that was the point. The pork had been preserved in barrels thick with brine. It had crossed states without spoiling, surviving heat, horses, and hands too tired to care. By the time it reached the saloon, it was no longer meat. It was memory. It was sliced, fried, served, sometimes with beans, sometimes alone, sometimes in a bowl of water that passed for soup. There was no fanfare, just a plate, a grunt from the cook, and a hunger too polite to ask questions. The whiskey helped, took the edge off, made the salt seem less cruel, and the pork less rubbery. Together, they made silence easier. Because after a shot and a slab, most men just stared at their boots, at the wall, at the space between things. Conversation happened in grunts, in nods, in the scrape of a knife against a plate that never matched the table. A man once claimed the pork had hair. The cook said he was lucky it added texture. No one laughed. They chewed. Sometimes, if the cook was in a good mood, he'd pour grease over the beans. It pooled on top, golden and heavy, made the beans richer, or at least wetter. You could dip your biscuit in it. You could drag the pork through it. You could pretend for one moment that the food had flavor, that it meant something. There were nights when a man might trade a story for a drink, or a favor for an extra slice. But most just paid with silence, with calloused hands that slid coins across the counter without looking up, and the barkeep never asked names. He only asked one thing: hot or stronger? Hot meant pork, stronger meant whiskey. And if a man answered both, well, he wasn't staying long. And no one ever really finished the salt pork. They just stopped eating it, left the last bite on the plate like a prayer or a warning, and the whiskey, that they always finished, even if it made their eyes water, even if it made the floor tilt, even if it made the ghosts come back louder, because whiskey in the Wild West wasn't about pleasure. It was about forgetting. Just enough. Not everything. Just the sharp edges. The salt pork stayed in your chest long after. You could feel it the next morning. Like a stone. Like a promise. Like a reason to keep moving. Together, the two were a meal. A terrible one. But a meal nonetheless, and when the sun dipped low again, and the wind rose through the cracks in the saloon walls, the same plates would be laid out, the same bottles uncorked, the same silence returned, and no one questioned it. Because in a world where everything changed, whiskey and pork were always waiting. A tea always looked better than it tasted. Golden, cracked on top like sun-baked earth, soft in the middle, at least in theory. Cornbread, the great deceiver of frontier meals, fresh out of the pan, it seemed like a small miracle. Warm, familiar, a food from back home, if home still meant anything. But one bite, and the illusion fell apart, sometimes literally. Dry, grainy, and stubborn, it clung to your teeth and choked your throat, like it was angry you dared to eat it. Still, it was served. Often. Because it was cheap. And quick. And didn't need much, just cornmeal, water. Maybe a splash of buttermilk if someone was feeling fancy, which almost no one ever was. The cook slapped it into cast iron pans already hot from frying salt pork, and it came out crusted in yesterday's grease. He never looked pleased with it, but he made it anyway, mumbling under his breath. A string of curses as steady as the rising heat, cornbread and curses. A recipe passed down by necessity, not tradition. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The curses weren't angry, just tired. Soft-spoken frustrations about stoves that smoked too early, batter that refused to rise, or flour sacks with more holes than grain. But the cook kept cursing, and the cornbread kept coming. It didn't hold together well, broke apart in your hand like old chalk. Some tried dunking it in stew, others soaked it in coffee. A few just swallowed without chewing, eyes watering, throat tightening. You never finished the whole piece. Not because you didn't want to, but because you could end single quotes. It was dry enough to pull the moisture from the air. Men joked that it cured hangovers by turning your stomach to stone. One said he used it to plug a hole in his boot. No one laughed. Still, when a tray came out fresh, the saloon quieted. Eyes followed the pan. Noses twitched at the smell, still sweet with the memory of corn. And hands reached fast, but not greedy. Everyone knew there wasn't much. The crust was always the best part. Crunchy, brown, just shy of burned. It snapped like bark and left flakes on your fingers. That part you savored. Even if the middle betrayed you later, there was something about cornbread that made men think of better times. Of mothers with aprons. Of tables with tablecloths. Of Sunday dinners that didn't end in silence. A tea made them forget where they were. Just long enough to take another bite. Sometimes it came with honey. if someone had been lucky or clever in their travels. A rare sweetness. Thick and golden, it turned the dry into something edible, almost tender. But those nights were rare. Most nights, the only sweetness came from memory, and the curses kept coming. From the kitchen, from the tables, from men muttering to themselves after choking on a second mouthful, because the truth was, everyone hated it, and everyone wanted it. At the same time, a man once said cornbread was like a woman you'd left behind, dry, difficult, and full of old lessons. The cook threw a ladle at him. It missed, but the point was made. In summer, the bread baked too fast and crumbled into dust. In winter, it stayed soggy in the middle, raw and clinging to the pan like it had secrets. But it never stopped coming because it filled the space on the plate, because it gave the cook something to do, because it made the saloon smell like something had been made instead of just survived. And after a while, even the worst foods become familiar. Even the things that scrape your throat on the way down can start to feel like home. The men knew that. They chewed slowly, eyes half closed, pretending. They didn't notice the grit. Pretending the piece in their hand wasn't identical to the one they couldn't finish the night before. Pretending this was what they'd asked for, but no one said it out loud. No one dared insult the cornbread. Not because it was sacred, but because it was their. It was constant, stubborn, like the land itself. At the end of the night, when the lamps dimmed and boots dragged across the warped boards, there were always a few crumbs left behind, swept into piles, fed to dogs, or forgotten, and the cook, arms crossed, would stare at the empty pan like it owed him something. He'd mutter again, maybe spit in the fire, maybe sit down and eat the last crust himself, and tomorrow he'd make it again, knowing no one liked it, but knowing quietly, secretly, that they'd all come back for more. Because in the Wild West, food didn't have to be good. It just had to be there. Hot, heavy, and waiting. Pie was a rumor before it was a dessert. You'd hear about it the way you'd hear about rain in a dry summer, quietly, suspiciously. From a man who claimed he'd seen it once, they'd say it like a confession. The saloon had pie last week. You'd squint. What kind? And he'd pause, stare into the middle distance. Brown, because that's what it was. Brown, not apple, not berry, just pie, with crust that flacked like shale and filling. That stuck to your teeth like regret. It came out late, when the meat was gone and the stew pot scraped dry. When the cook had time, patience, or both. When someone had traded a sack of dried fruit, or when a can had been found at the back of the pantry. Rusted but unopened, there was no schedule, no recipe, just chance. And FLIs, if you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below. And subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The moment a pie hit the table, the sound changed. Forks paused. Chairs scooted. A dozen eyes turned, slow and heavy, toward the counter, because pie wasn't normal. It was special. Even if it didn't taste that way, the crust was more crust than cake, hard, stubborn, sometimes burnt around the edges. The kind of crust that fought the knife, then fought your teeth. But it held together. And that was something, the filling. Nobody knew. Could have been prunes. Could have been something someone found growing near the tracks. It was always sweetish, sour-ish, thick, sticky, brown. The sugar, if there was any, was more suggestion than ingredient. Most sweetness came from memory, from the way your mother used to make it, from the idea of pie, more than the taste, and always, without fail, the FLIs came not in swarms, Just a few. Persistent. Buzzing low over the counter, drawn to the syrupy. Smell like ghosts to a song they half-remembered. No1 swatted them away. That would have broken the moment. Pie was too rare to interrupt. Some used their napkin to shield their slice. Others simply ate faster. Fast enough to win the race. Not against the other men, against the FLIs. You'd eat it in bites, sharp and small, careful not to lose any to the crust shatter or the fillings slide. The tin plate would be licked clean, not with tongues, but with biscuits. Whatever was handy. No one wasted pie. No1 saved pie. Leftovers didn't happen. A slice of pie in a saloon wasn't a luxury. It was a myth you got to chew. A brief break from the chew of pork and the burn of whiskey. A reminder, however faint, that sweetness still existed, even if it was sticky. Even if it had seeds. Even if the aftertaste lingered longer than the joy. Men who'd fought wars, lost fortunes, crossed deserts barefoot. They'd close their eyes after the first bite, just for a second. To remember or to forget, pie had that power. Not because it was good, but because it wasn't necessary. It didn't have to be there. It chose to be. Or someone chose it, and that alone gave it weight. The cook never explained where it came from, just served it with a shrug, as if to say, "Here, don't ask again." He'd cut it into uneven slices, sometimes with a knife, sometimes with a spatula, so bent it resembled a spoon having a bad day. He never took a slice for himself. Not in front of anyone, at least. There were rumors that he kept one piece behind the stove, wrapped in cloth, hidden, for bad nights, or good ones, or the kind of night when even whiskey wouldn't do, and if someone asked for seconds, well, they didn't. Not because it was rude, but because they already knew the answer. The pie wasn't meant to be devoured. It was meant to be witnessed, eaten slowly, respected. Even the FLIs seemed to understand. They didn't land, just circled, buzzed, drew near, waited, because this was pie, not war, not hunger, just pie, brown, flaky, misshapen, perfect in all the ways the West wasn't, fleeting, sweet, gone too soon when the last crumb was gone, when the tin plates clinked back onto wooden counters, when the cook washed his hands in a bucket of gray water. There was a silence, not sad, just soft, and the men returned to their beans, to their boots, to the salt pork and the cornbread that left their mouths dry. But somewhere, deep in their bellies, was the memory of something different, something that hadn't been needed but had come anyway. And in the West, that was as close to a blessing as you could get. He wasn't the first face you saw when you walked into the saloon. He wasn't behind the bar, and he didn't come out to greet strangers. But he was there, always there, behind the smoke, behind the heat, behind a curtain of grease-soaked air that turned men into silhouettes. They just called him the cook, and that was enough. No one knew where he'd come from, or how long he'd been standing over that stove. His boots had holes where his toes bent. His apron had layers, stains laid over years like tree rings. He didn't smile. Not once. Not even on pie days, but he fed the town. And that was something more valuable than kindness. He didn't speak unless he had to. And when he did, it came low and rough, like a shovel dragged through gravel. Mostly he muttered to the beans, to the stew, to the fire that kept dying. When the wind slipped through the cracks in the wall, his hands moved constantly, cracking eggs if he had them, chopping onions with a blade that looked more weapon than tool, folding biscuits like they were enemies that needed softening, and yet there was care in it. Not tenderness, but presence. He didn't make food that tasted good. He made food that lasted. Some said he'd been a soldier. Others thought he came west with a woman and lost her. A few believed he'd always been there, built into the wood of the place like the bar itself. No one asked. And he didn't offer. He was there before the sun, and still there after the last chair scraped across the floor. He stirred the stew as if it mattered. And maybe to him, it did. The fire liked him. It stayed lit longer when he stood near it. The pans didn't burn as fast. The coffee, while still vile, had less bitterness when he made it. No one dared tell him this. He wouldn't have listened, wouldn't have cared. He didn't cook for praise. He cooked because people were hungry, because bellies needed filling, because there was something sacred in the act of feeding someone who hadn't asked for more than heat. Once, a young man complained, said the pork was too salty, the beans too soft. The cornbread tasted like sawdust and broken dreams. The cook didn't look up. He just served him a second helping. Twice the salt. No one complained after that. There was a rhythm to his work. Not elegant, not fast, but steady, like a heartbeat in a sleeping animal. He knew when the biscuits were done without looking, knew when the stew had thickened just enough, knew how to tilt the coffee pot so the worst of the grounds didn't pour out. And in the evening, when the room quieted, when the men had finished chewing and begun forgetting again, he'd step back, wipe his hands, and lean against the wall, not to rest, just to watch, not with pride, but with the blank, familiar ache of a man who'd done this before. Too many times to count. If someone dropped a fork, he'd pick it up. If someone didn't finish their beans, he'd scrape them into the fire. He didn't waste, didn't hoard, didn't hesitate. Some nights, when the moon was high and the whiskey bottles had tipped, someone would try to talk to him, ask him his name, where he learned to cook, what he'd done before this. He never answered, just shook his head, slow, like brushing off dust. The truth was, no one really wanted to know. They liked him as a fixture, a quiet shape behind the food, a shadow that kept the kitchen going when everything else was falling apart. Because if the cook stopped, if his knife paused, if his fire went out, what then? The saloon would go on, maybe. The chairs would stay. The beans might be made by someone else, but it wouldn't be the same, because food made by a man who didn't smile somehow tasted more honest. It didn't try to comfort you, didn't try to distract. It told you what you already knew, that survival was the goal, that some meals were meant to be endured, not enjoyed, that filling the belly was sometimes the only kindness the world could offer. And in that way, he was the kindest man in town. They never said thank you, not out loud, but they came back every night, sat in the same chairs, held out the same bowls, waited for the ladle, the plate, the pan passed down without words, and the cook, sleeves rolled, face unreadable, served them all, one after the other, until the fire dimmed, until the silence returned, until the day was over. He never smiled, but he never stopped feeding them, and maybe that was better. The floorboards were dark not from stain, but from habit, from boots that dragged and spit, that landed where it pleased, from soup spilled carelessly, boots stomped thoughtlessly, and tobacco juice that found every crack and crevice like it had a mind of its own. A saloon wasn't just a place to eat. It was a place to be, to exist in whatever shape you had left. By nightfall, and for many, that meant chewing tobacco while eating soup, one tucked in the cheek, the other ladled into the mouth. At first glance, it seemed impossible. Two acts that had no business sharing a table. But in the West, contradiction was a way of life. And so, there they sat, men with jaws swollen from tobacco, lips stained dark, slurping soup like it was their last rite. They'd pull it off with a strange rhythm. A bite of soup, a pause, a chew, a lean to the side tooey, the sound of juice hitting the floor. Then back to the spoon. It wasn't done in shame. It wasn't hidden. It was as natural as breathing. The soup didn't ask questions. And neither did the man who made it. The cook didn't care where they spit, as long as it wasn't in the stew pot. And even that line was more of a hope than a rule. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video, and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The soup itself was a watery affair. A broth more than a meal. Boiled from bones to clean, vegetables to tired, and water too warm to question. It had floaters, bits of onion, shreds of meat, scraps of whatever hadn't spoiled. Sometimes it was salty. Sometimes it wasn't. No one cared. It was hot. It filled the space between whiskey and hunger. It gave men something to wrap their hands around, and in that warmth, they found enough comfort to lean back, spit to the floor, and let their jaws rest. The tobacco came in pouches, black as coal and soft like tar. Some men chewed all day, swallowing the juice when they couldn't afford to spit. Others waited until soup time, when the mix of hot broth and sour chew made their mouths feel busy and their stomachs feel less empty. It wasn't polite. It wasn't sanitary. But it was normal. Napkins were rare. Handkerchiefs were sacred. So the spitting continued into the dirt, into tin cups meant for something else. Once, into a boot left unattended, the air was thick with scent, spice, salt, meat, and the unmistakable bitterness of chewed leaf. It clung to your clothes, settled in your beard, lingered in the rafters long after the men had gone. Some tried, eating soup without chewing. They were mocked. Soft, they were called. Or worse, Eastern. It wasn't that anyone liked the taste of the tobacco or the soup, but something about them together made sense. The bite of the chew numbed the mouth. The warmth of the soup brought it back. A back and forth. A quiet balance. They'd sit like that for an hour, spooning broth, rolling chew between their teeth, saying nothing, just being. In a town where words were often dangerous, where every story could end in violence, this simple, strange ritual became peace. One man said the tobacco made the soup taste better. Another swore the soup cured the burn of a bad chew. No one tested these theories. They just nodded and kept eating. You learned to avoid the splash zone. The man to your left might spit sideways. The one across from you might forget where he was. But no one got angry. Not really. It was just part of the place. Even the floor seemed resigned, covered in sawdust that soaked up the juice and deadened the sound. The boards groaned but didn't protest. Sometimes the cook swept it all away at the end of the night. Sometimes he didn't. He said the spit kept the bugs away. He said it gave the room flavor. He said a lot of things no one believed. But everyone accepted, because when the soup was gone and the tobacco ran dry, the men sat back, eyes low, hands folded. They didn't thank the cook, didn't praise the food. They just nodded once, slow and firm, and rose with the creak of tired bones, and the floor, stained and sticky, bore witness to another night of strange comfort, of soup and spit, of silence that wasn't empty, because in a town with nothing soft, a spoonful of warmth and a cheekful of chew could be the closest thing to grace, and somehow it was. The pot never got cold. Not really. Even when the fire dipped low and the embers whispered their last sigh, the pot stayed warm, and inside it beans. Still there, still thick, still waiting. They were the first things served when the sun cracked over the hills. And the last thing ladled when the saloon doors creaked shut for the night. Beans for breakfast. Beans for bed. And no one questioned it. Not because they liked it, but because it was true. Some things, no matter how unkind, become a kind of comfort when they never leave you. The morning bowl was always different. Not in flavor, in silence. Men came in bleary-eyed, some still half drunk from the night before. They sat without speaking, boots heavy with dew, mouths dry with memory. And the beans were already waiting. A ladle scraped the side of the pot with the sound of tired habit. A dollop dropped into a tin bowl with a wet thud. Steam rose. So did the men's shoulders, just slightly, as if they could find warmth by osmosis. There was no bread with the morning beans. No meat. Just beans. And the remnants of whatever had simmered overnight. Sometimes you found a shred of onion, or something that used to be pork. Sometimes nothing, but the heat was there. The weight. The way they slid across your tongue and settled in your stomach like a brick disguised as mercy. The cook said nothing. Just served. He knew better than to speak in the morning. Men didn't want stories. They wanted silence and something that wouldn't hurt their teeth. They'd eat hunched over, chewing slowly, each spoonful an act of survival. No eye contact, no greetings. Just the slow scrape of tin and the occasional sigh that sounded like a whisper from the grave. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The beans weren't made fresh each day. They just kept going. Water added. Fire stoked. More beans dumped in as needed. A living stew. Ancient. Immortal. Mostly edible. And by nightfall, they were still there. Still hot. Still heavy. Still enough, only now. The room was louder. Laughter floated over whiskey bottles. Cards slapped against tables. Boots tapped to tunes played on out-of-tune pianos. And the beans, they remained unchanged, a constant in a world of chaos. A reminder that no matter how the day went, you'd end it the same way you began. Some called it punishment. Others called it peace. But everyone called it dinner. They came in groups now. A pair of ranch hands. A miner with soot on his fingers. A drifter with blood on his sleeve. They all sat. They all waited. And the cook gave them the same thing he gave the morning crowd. But this time, maybe with a biscuit, or the end of a salt pork slab. Maybe the night beans were thicker, richer, not in flavor, but in presence. Like they had soaked up the hours between sunrise and sunset, carried the stories, held the weight. Some men said they tasted different at night. Like smoke, like sorrow, like home, but no one was sure. The saloon dimmed slowly. Lamps turned low. Voices softened. And still the bowl stayed full. Some men took seconds. A rare act of optimism. Others just sat holding their spoon like it was a tether to the world. The cook would watch, wiping his hands on a cloth that had never known clean. He didn't smile, but he didn't scowl either. Just watched, and when the last bowl was scraped clean, he didn't say a word. Just lifted the pot, carried it to the back, and added more water because morning would come. It always did. And the beans would still be needed. They were never praised. No one toasted to them. But in the spaces between hunger and sleep, they offered something rare, predictability. You could lose your job, lose your horse, lose your name, but you wouldn't lose the beans. They were always there for the hungover. the heartbroken, the homesick, a spoonful of sameness in a world built on change. And when a man finished his last bite, set his bowl aside, and leaned his head against the wall with his hat tipped low, you knew he wasn't just full. He was safe. For a while, the fire hissed softly behind the stove. A chair creaked. A breath was held. And the night settled in, bean-scented and strangely holy. There was a smell to every saloon, long before you crossed the threshold. A heavy, greasy perfume that clung to the porch rails and drifted out through crooked doors. It wasn't just food. It was everything: burned meat, old sweat, wood soaked with 1,000 spills, and something metallic faint, but always there. Gunmetal, the scent of readiness, of violence waiting its turn between bites. Inside, the air felt heavier. You didn't notice it at first, but after a few steps, you realized your tongue had a film on it. Salt, smoke, oil, and something sharper every corner of the room had seen. A moment of danger, a spilled drink, a drawn knife, a shout that came too loud, too fast. But it was the smell that told the truth. This wasn't a dining hall. It was a den. Grease lived here, soaked into the floorboards, caked onto the stove, spattered up the walls like abstract art, painted in bacon fat. And no one cleaned it. Not properly. They just wiped the surfaces with old cloths, pushing the slickness from one end of the room to the other, like spreading a story you hoped no one would remember too well. There was a comfort in it. Grease meant heat. Heat meant cooking. Cooking meant survival, and beside it guns, always nearby, leaning against a chair, resting on the bar, still warm from the sun, or still cold from the night. Dot and no one touched them unless they had to. But no one forgot them either. The scent of oil used to clean them mingled with the food, creating something that was both domestic and dangerous. A kitchen smell, interrupted by war. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below. And subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Sometimes a man would lay his pistol down beside his bowl of stew, not to threaten, just to remind. This was the West. Meals were eaten in the shadow of firepower, a spoon in one hand, a revolver in the other. The cook didn't care. He moved between smoke and steel like it was all the same. The gunmetal and the grease both clung to his sleeves. He wiped his hands, stirred the pot, never flinched. The chairs creaked beneath weight and weapon. Belts sagged with bullets. Knives tapped gently against thighs as men leaned forward to chew. But rarely did anything erupt. Because here, oddly enough, food was sacred. You could curse. You could spit. You could argue over cards or women or who owed what. But you didn't fight during supper. The scent of grease softened tempers. The heavy presence of metal reminded everyone, what you start, you'll have to finish. And no one liked finishing things in the middle of a hot meal. The back wall held the worst stains. Grease spat from the stove. Blood, maybe. Or just spilled whiskey. No one asked. No one scrubbed. Over time, it all blurred together. One big mural of life lived too close to heat, hunger, and hurt. Even the FLIs avoided that wall. Even the light tried not to land there. Yet somehow, the saloon didn't feel unclean. Just seasoned, like a cast iron pan, dark with use, glossy. From story, you'd walk in, sit down, and inhale that blend of breakfast bacon and black powder. And in a strange way, it calmed you because it meant no one had cleaned the place out in the night. It meant you were still part of the story, even if your boots stuck to the floor. Even if your hands smelled like lard by the time you finished your biscuit. there was a comfort in permanence. And grease had permanence. So did guns. So did grief, and all three had a seat at the table. A man once polished his revolver with the corner of his shirt while sipping coffee too thick to pour. Another used the butt of his rifle to crack the crust on a pie someone claimed was fresh. No one flinched. Because this was just how things were, there was no dividing line between the kitchen and the battlefield. Only the stove, and the fire inside it. When the day faded and the oil lamps cast their gold across the sheen of the bar, you could see streaks of grease gleam beside pistol shadows, like ghosts of action, echoes of meals eaten on edge, and maybe that was why. No one smiled much while they ate. Not fully. There was always a piece of them listening for trouble, waiting for footsteps to fast, waiting for a chair to scrape to hard. The food was warm. The guns were loaded. The grease stayed, and that was peace. In its own strange way, there was always something left on the plate. Not much, just a crust, a smear, a spoonful cooling in the bottom of a bowl. Not because men were ungrateful, but because some bites weren't meant to be finished. And some were saved for the brave, or the foolish. Leftovers in a saloon weren't like the ones back home. You didn't wrap them up. You didn't label them. You didn't tuck them away in tidy cupboards. You left them where they landed. And someone eventually would decide if they were worth the risk. The gamblers came first, not the card sharps or dice rollers, but the hungry men who hovered near the edge of tables, eyeing plates that still held food. They didn't beg, didn't ask. They just waited, quiet, patient, like dogs who knew not to bark. Sometimes they were strangers, drifters, workers who'd been paid in promises, too proud to steal, too poor to buy. They'd stand near the stove, hands in pockets, eyes low. And when a man stood up, wiped his mouth, and walked away, they'd move. Quick and smooth, not rushing, but with a purpose. A cold biscuit, a third of a slice of pork fat, a puddle of beans that had already gone dry around the edges. It wasn't much, but it was something, and in the West, something was a win. The cook didn't stop them. He didn't say a word. If the food was still hot, he might wave them off. But if it had cooled, if the moment had passed, he let them have it, maybe out of kindness. Maybe because throwing it away felt worse. Some tried their luck with soup bowls that still had streaks of grease clinging to the sides. They'd tip the bowl, swipe it with a piece of bread if they had it, fingers if they didn't. They'd close their eyes as they chewed, not to savor, but to forget what it meant. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Leftovers were their own kind of currency. They told stories. Who was too full to finish? Who didn't? Like cornbread. Who had eaten fast, and who had picked at their plate like a man waiting for something better. Sometimes the regulars would leave a little extra on purpose. A whole biscuit placed just so. A scrap of meat with a bit more fat than usual. They didn't say anything. Didn't look at the man who came for it, but they left it. And that meant something. The cook noticed. He always noticed. And sometimes, if the leftover was claimed fast enough, he'd slide an extra spoonful into the next bowl. Quiet reward. Quiet gratitude. But not all leftovers were so kindly given. Sometimes they sat too long, curled at the edges, grew slick. And that's when the real gamblers appeared, the men who'd eat anything, because they had nothing. Because tomorrow's breakfast was not a guarantee. They'd take bites of stew that had stiffened, gnawed on bread so dry it snapped, sipped coffee left cold in the bottom of mugs, and braved the bitter silt. And if they got sick, They didn't complain, just lay low, waited for the ache to pass, hoped it wasn't meat from something that had died on its own. You'd see them. Sometimes out back, by the rain barrel, bent over, holding their sides. And the cook would shake his head, but never say, "I told you so," because the rules were clear. You ate what you found, and you gambled, even the FLIs gambled. They'd circle the plates, land, sip, flee, sometimes beaten away, sometimes ignored, and sometimes the food was fine, better than expected, still warm, still good. That was the jackpot, the rare win, a biscuit, not yet hard, beans with a bit of life left, stew where the grease hadn't turned to glue. On those nights, you saw a smile, not wide, not joyful, just a soft lift at the corners of a cracked mouth, and that was victory. The cook never ate the leftovers. He had his own plate made fresh. Always late, always alone. He said once, "I don't eat what's been decided by someone else," but not everyone had that luxury. The gamblers of leftovers knew this. They lived by it, and when the tables were cleared, and the lamps were dimmed, and the sound of chewing faded into the creak of the walls, they stayed behind, licked fingers, wiped their mouths, bent to pick up what crumbs the broom had missed. It wasn't shame. It was life, because in the Wild West, nothing was wasted. Not time, not bullets, not beans, not even silence. And if a man found warmth in the bottom of another's bowl, then maybe, just maybe, he'd sleep easier. There was no chandelier, no tablecloth, no fine silver, just wax, smoke, and a long room full of men with shadows stretched across their faces. Dinner in a frontier saloon wasn't served at a proper hour. It came when the pot was full, when the cook had finished muttering, when the room began to settle into the low hush of night, and it was eaten not under lamps, but by candlelight, wicks dipped in tallow, flames flickering against fogged windows, casting gold onto the grease-dark wood and the worn backs of coats that had braved wind and miles. There was a softness to it, but not the kind found in parlors or poems. This was the softness of weariness, of a belly almost full, of firelight that made ugly things look briefly kind. The candles were stubby, some jammed into old bottles, others stuck in tin saucers filled with ash. They dripped slowly, wax running, like tears down the necks of forgotten whiskey flasks. And beside each flame, a cigar, because in this place, men ate with smoke curling past their ears. Cigars came cheap and came often, traded in bundles, rolled too loose or too tight. They smelled like barns and burnt rope, but they lasted. And that was enough. A man would light his cigar before the first bite, the tip flaring orange as he leaned into the flame, cupping the spark like it was the only warmth he trusted. Then he'd eat soup, beans, a sliver of pork, maybe half a biscuit. If the cook hadn't burned the tray, and the cigar would rest between his fingers or clenched between his teeth, puffing slowly between bites, smoke drifted over the stew pot, over bread crusts, over coffee mugs blackened from too many washes in cold water. The room didn't mind. The smell of food and tobacco mingled until they were indistinguishable. Salt and smoke, grease and ash, a palette of survival painted in. Every breath. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Some use the cigars to light the candles. Others use the candles to relight the cigars. Everything borrowed fire from everything else, as if flames were the only language still spoken here. And when someone spoke, which wasn't often, they spoke softly, not out of respect, but out of weariness. No one wanted to shout in a room lit by flame. The walls felt too close. The quiet to thick, you'd hear the scratch of forks, the low hum of someone chewing, the occasional cough sharp and wet from the back corner, but mostly just breath, slow and steady. Between bites, between puffs, the cook would appear sometimes just to trim the candle wicks. He didn't ask. He just leaned over a table with a small knife, sliced the blackened tip away, and moved on .no. One thanked him. He didn't wait for thanks because it wasn't about the light. It was about the shape the light made, how it bent the harsh lines of hunger into something gentler. Night. Men looked different, softer, even the angry ones, even the sad ones. A face that had scowled all day might relax, just for a moment, as the flame swayed and the cigar burned low. And there were no rules about where the ashes landed. Some flicked them into mugs. Others tapped them onto the floor, adding to the slow gray layer that always covered the boards by morning. The food wasn't better by candlelight, but it felt better, like it mattered more, like it was part of a ritual instead of a routine, a slow spoonful of stew, a long drag from a cigar, a sip of something warm, if not kind. No one told stories here. Not the real ones, but once in a while, someone would speak into the glow of the flame, voice low, just loud enough for no one to answer. A memory, a name, a joke that no one laughed at, but everyone understood, and the candle would flicker, and the smoke would rise, and the cook would wipe his hands on his apron, look at the wax puddle forming on the counter, and go back to his fire. By the time the flames had died down, so had the voices. The cigars had burned to nubs, the plates pushed forward empty, and the room felt quieter than before. Not because of absence, but because of stillness, the kind that only comes after eating in the dark, while the world forgets you, and in the soft silence of wax and ash they stayed, for just a little longer, holding on to the heat, the breath, the light, because in the Wild West, where everything moved fast and ended faster, a slow meal by candlelight was the closest thing to mercy. It didn't look like much. Just an old table with uneven legs, tucked into the far corner beneath a sagging window pane that hadn't latched properly in years. The candle on it always burned lower than the rest. Maybe because the wind got in there, or maybe because some spaces just knew how to be lonely. The table didn't attract much attention. Not from the cook, not from the regulars, not even from the FLIs, but someone always sat there, not the loud ones, not the gamblers or the drifters looking for a fight. No, this table was for the quiet ones, the ones with eyes that had seen too far, hands that twitched from memory, mouths that had nothing left to say. He'd come in just after dusk, not late enough to be noticed, not early enough to belong. Boots scuffed, hat pulled low, jacket stitched, with patches that weren't meant to match. He didn't look at anyone, didn't nod, didn't cough or clear his throat, just walked to that table, his table, and sat down like gravity had summoned him. The cook knew. He didn't ask what he wanted, just filled a bowl with whatever was hot, set it down without a word, and left the man to it. There was no ritual, no prayer, no toast, just a man, a spoon, and a long, slow silence. The candle flickered as he ate, always to one side, casting shadows that stretched across the wall behind him, tall and thin like old regrets. He ate slow, not lazily, just carefully, like someone used to saving half for later, even when there was no later. Sometimes he finished it all. Sometimes he didn't, but he always left the spoon in the bowl, always turned the bowl a little to the left before he stood. No one asked why. No one followed him out. He'd disappear into the dark, boots muffled by the packed dirt road, and the table would sit empty until morning. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Other men used that table, but it never seemed to belong to them. They shifted too much, sat too loud, left their crumbs in careless piles, but he was different. He left no trace but warmth, a ghost of steam rising from the bowl, a candle stub a little shorter than before. The barkeep said he'd been coming there for years, or maybe weeks. No one could remember. Time get fuzzy in places like this, especially in corners. Some said he'd lost someone, a wife, a child, a town. Others said he'd been rich once, owned land, lost it. Now he ate beans like the rest of them. A few believed he was never really there, just a figment, a shadow the candlelight to play with. Grief made real, given a coat and a spoon and a place to sit, but the cook knew better. He made sure the bowl was clean, that it had weight, that the food inside wasn't scraped from the bottom of the pot, because whatever story followed the man, he deserved warmth, and in a room that rarely offered kindness. The corner table did. The others noticed him. They didn't say it, but they made space. They kept their voices low, their boots away from his path. Respect, maybe, or superstition. Either way, he ate in peace, even on loud nights when the piano stumbled through another tune and the dice rolled with the sound of dried bones. His table stayed quiet. The candle flickered, the spoon lifted, the bowl emptied, and when he left, he never pushed his chair in. That's how you knew he'd be back. He never spoke to the cook, never once. But one night, just once, he paused by the stove, touched the rim of his hat, and nodded. It wasn't gratitude. Not exactly. It was understanding, recognition. Two men who fed others in different ways. The cook didn't nod back, but he remembered, and from that night on, he always served the bowl with the freshest portion, even if it meant someone else got the crust, because in that quiet corner, under a window that let the cold in, something warm still happened. A man sat, a bowl steamed, a candle burned low, and in the stillness between spoonfuls, a kind of healing took place, not loud, not grand, but real. And sometimes in the Wild West, that was all a man could ask for. Bread wasn't baked, not out here. It was survived. You didn't wake to the scent of a rising loaf, warm and soft from a loving oven. You woke to the sound of wind under the door and a crust hard enough to chip a tooth if you weren't careful. They called it bread, but it had little in common with the loaves from back east. It didn't slice. It cracked. It crumbled. It curled up at the corners like it had been left too long in the sun, and often it had. Out here, the air was different. Dry when it didn't rain. Wet when you needed it dry. Filled with dust that crept into every sack of flour, every mixing bowl, every tired lung. The cook never blamed the recipe. He blamed the air. It molds it, he said, before it's even baked. And maybe he was right. The bread was mixed by hand, always in a bowl that had more dense than smooth. No yeast, just soda, or whatever passed for it that week. Sometimes buttermilk. Sometimes just water and prayer. It came out in slabs, not loaves, dropped onto scorched pans and shoved into stoves that breathed smoke more than fire. The crust formed fast, a kind of shield, a callus, to keep the world out, to keep the crumbs in. It was the kind of bread that knew how to last, that didn't ask to be liked, that didn't flinch at insult, and it molded. Not just from age, though, that came fast too, but from the air, from the way the room never stayed the same temperature, from the hands that made it, rough and tired, cracked and calloused, grinding dough with the weight of unspoken thoughts. Sometimes green spots bloomed across the surface. Sometimes blue. Sometimes both. Patterns like islands on a map no one wanted to visit. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. And a one threw it out. Not unless it smelled bad. And even then, it was a decision weighed carefully. Because bread was bread. Even if it bit back, some would scrape off the mold with a knife. Others tore away the softest part if there was one left. You didn't eat it all at once. You rationed it, folded it into napkins, hid it in your coat, let it harden more so it wouldn't disappear too quickly. It was rarely served warm. By the time it reached your plate, it had cooled and stiffened. And yet, there it was. A quiet, stubborn presence beside the stew, beside the beans, beside the silence. Sometimes a man would knock the crust against the edge of the table just to hear how solid it had become. Sometimes it sounded like bone. Sometimes it didn't sound at all, but always they ate it, dipped it in soup, let it soak long enough to bend without breaking, used it to mop plates, to catch the last of the grease, to line the stomach. Before whiskey burned it hollow again, a man once said, "This bread could stop a bullet." Another said, "No, but it could sure ruin your teeth." They weren't wrong. But they kept chewing. The cook knew better than to apologize for it. He didn't make it to impress. He made it because without bread, a meal felt like a question. Left unanswered, bread made the plate complete. Even if it was flawed. Even if it was feared, sometimes after the saloon closed, a few slices would remain. Left on counters, forgotten on plates. Hardening in the open air like tiny tombstones, the cook would gather them, wrap them in cloth, set them near the fire not too warm, but to soften slightly. A kindness he never explained. In the morning, he might crumble one into the beans, or serve it with molasses, if someone had remembered to barter for a jar, but most of the time, it was just there, waiting. Still. It didn't ask for praise. It didn't try to be more than it was, and there was something noble in that. In a world where everything rusted, broke, or betrayed you, the bread did neither. It just endured, quietly, grimly, one bite at a time. And for men who had learned to measure comfort by weight rather than flavor, that was enough, because even molded, even cracked the bread had made it through another day, just like them. They didn't have names anyone remembered. Not anymore. Maybe once when they first rode into town, or when someone called them brother or son or friend, but in the saloon, they were just shapes. Quiet shapes in the corner. Bent hats. Tired boots. Eyes that didn't meet yours, the forgotten ones. They didn't talk much, didn't laugh at the jokes, didn't drink unless the bottle was passed to them without a word, but they came. Every night, sat in the same places, waited for the same food. The cook knew who they were. Not by name, but by silence. He didn't treat them different, didn't serve them first, but he made sure they had something on their plate. Even if the pork was gone, even if the biscuits were burned, he always found a scoop of beans that had softened just enough. A slice of bread less hard than the rest. A sliver of pie crust, if any had survived the rush, and he placed it in front of them gently. Not like a gift. Not like charity. Just a gesture. Like setting a coat on a chair before someone sits. Sometimes they nodded. Sometimes they didn't even look up. But they ate. Slow. Grateful in the way that doesn't need thanks. They were old men. Young men. Men in between. Some had stories that no one asked about. Others had none left to tell. They lived behind the stables under wagons. In the barns, no. One locked any more, and when they came to eat, they didn't linger. They finished quickly, folded their hands, and watched the flame of the nearest candle as if it might say something worth remembering. If you're still settling in, maybe leave. A quiet like on this video, and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Occasionally, someone new joined them. A man who had once been loud, now quieter. A man who had once bought rounds, now waiting to be offered one. It happened slowly. The forgetting, not on purpose. Just through days that passed too quietly. Through stories no one listened to. Through smiles that stopped being returned, and yet they were never refused a meal, not once. The cook made sure of that. A traveler once sneered, called them freeloaders, said they should work for their food. The room went still. The cook didn't speak. He just picked up a ladle, held it like a hammer, and turned it once in his hand. That was enough. The traveler left, and the forgotten stayed. Finished their food, tucked their spoons into their pockets, and drifted out like dusk. Some tried to repay it. In their own way, they stacked their bowls when they were done, wiped crumbs from the table with their sleeves, pulled a coin from a pocket so worn you wondered how it had survived. The cook didn't take the money. He never did. He just nodded at the gesture. The intention, because what they had already paid was more than coin. They had paid in miles, in days without warmth, in eyes that had seen too many last meals. The food wasn't good. It wasn't generous, but it was enough. A bowl of beans, a corner of bread, a sip of coffee that didn't burn anymore because their mouths had forgotten how to feel, and in those few minutes, they weren't forgotten. They were fed, and that mattered more than anyone said aloud. Sometimes, when the fire was low and the floor had been swept, the cook would leave a plate near the back door, not because he expected anyone, but because someone might come. A hand might reach from the dark, lift the cloth, take the bread, and vanish. No thanks. No name. Just the soft echo of footsteps fading into the night, and the cook would return in the morning, find the plate empty, and nod once. Not a smile, not a prayer, just acknowledgement that someone still needed warmth, still needed salt, still needed to be remembered, even if only by a bowl, because in the Wild West there were no plaques, no portraits, no songs written for the tired and the left behind, but there was food, still hot, still waiting, still enough, and for the forgotten, that was something close to being found. It didn't happen often. Once, maybe twice a season. But when it did, the room felt different. A little quieter, a little slower, as if even the dust knew something had shifted. It would begin the same way, a man walking in with a box under his arm. Not a crate, not a bag, a box. Wooden, worn smooth, the kind that held keepsakes once, and now just barely held together. He wouldn't speak. He'd hand it to the cook, who'd take it without asking, and for the rest of the evening, something strange would happen in that little saloon kitchen. A meal would be made that meant something, not survival food, not reheated beans or biscuit, crusts, but a dish that belonged to a memory. Sometimes it was stew thicker than usual, seasoned with something that wasn't just salt. Sometimes it was cornbread, but with sugar mixed in, just enough to make someone's throat tighten. Once, it was apple dumplings. Where the apples came from, no one asked, but the smell filled the room like a hymn. Soft and aching, the cook wouldn't talk much while he made it, just moved differently, slower, more careful, as if the bowl was an altar and the meal a prayer. When it was done, he'd serve it to one person, just one, The man who'd brought the box, he'd sit alone at a corner table. The same table where he used to sit with her. No one asked who she was, but they all knew a wife, a sister, a mother, maybe just a woman who once made him feel human. She wasn't here now. That was the one truth no one needed confirmed. And the meal? It wasn't for taste. It was for memory. He'd eat slowly, chew each bite like it might vanish if he rushed. Let the spoon rest between mouthfuls, as if holding it too tightly might break the moment and the others. They respected it. They didn't drink too loud, didn't slap cards down with too much force, didn't ask what was in the pot or why it smelled better than usual. They just let the meal happen. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Sometimes the cook would make enough for one more bowl. Set it on the counter. Leave it untouched. No one dared take it. Not that night, because everyone understood that bowl wasn't for them. It was for her, or the idea of her, or the hollow space she left behind. It would sit there, gathering steam that curled toward the ceiling like a whisper, until it cooled and the light grew too dim to pretend it was still full. Then the cook would carry it to the back, empty it into the fire, not wastefully, but reverently, like returning a gift to where it came from. The man would finish his meal, place the spoon carefully in the bowl, and rise slowly. Not tired, just older than when he sat down. Sometimes he'd leave a coin, sometimes a flower, sometimes nothing at all, but the table would remember. So would the cook. So would the room, because in a place built for forgetting, a meal like that was sacred, not because it filled the belly, but because it reached somewhere deeper, somewhere hunger couldn't name. And the cook, though he never smiled, moved a little softer the next day, used the cleaner side of the cloth, stirred the beans a bit more gently. He didn't ask for stories, didn't want to know who she was. That wasn't his job. His job was the meal, to make it like she would have, to serve it like it mattered. And for one night, in a saloon that had seen more grief than grace, something warm rose from a bowl of stew or a plate of dumplings and wrapped around the heart of a man too tired to cry. It wasn't healing. Not quite. But it was remembering. And sometimes that was close enough, because in the Wild West, where people vanished without goodbye, and names faded faster than fences, a meal made for the dead was the kindest way to say, "You're loved." Once. And someone still remembers. There were things you didn't talk about, even in the open honesty of a saloon kitchen. Things that everyone knew, but no one voiced aloud. Like where the water came from, or what kind of meat was in the stew, or how many rats had found their way into the flour sack this week, because they always found their way in. Flour was precious. Not because it was rare, though sometimes it was, but because it was hope, ground fine and bagged tight, carried for miles in wagons that broke down more often than they arrived. It was supposed to be clean, white, pure, but the West had other plans. The sacks were tied with old rope, stacked in corners that stayed just a little too damp, just a little too dark, and in the silence between midnight and morning, that's when they came. Tiny claws on wood, squeaks like secrets, a rustle in the shadows. Rats, they didn't ask, didn't knock. They just tore their way in, and in the morning, you'd find it. A fine dusting of paw prints, a small hole at the base of the sack, and the quiet knowledge that something small had stolen something big. The cook never cursed them, just shook his head, cut the sack open, scooped out what was bad, saved what he could. You couldn't throw it all away. Not out here. Not when the next shipment might not come. Not when men expected biscuits in the morning, and there was nothing else to make them with. So you sifted, You inspected. You hoped. The fine mesh strainer became more than a tool, it was a test of faith. Each grain of flour passed through slowly, watched with eyes that had learned not to flinch. If something hard landed on the tray, you ignored it. Or you didn't. Depending on the day, if you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Rats weren't the worst thing that could end up in your food. They were just the most honest. They came for warmth, for crumbs. For the same reason, the men came hunger. You couldn't blame them for that, and the flour, once sifted, once deemed good enough, went into dough, into pans, into mouths. No1 asked if it had visitors last night. They didn't want to know. They just wanted biscuits that didn't break. Their teeth, bread that didn't turn green by morning, and so the cook worked with what he had. Sometimes adding lard to stretch it. Sometimes whiskey. Sometimes a bit of salt to hide the flavor of worry. A rat never killed a man out here. Not directly, but the things they carried. That was another story. Still, the saloon never turned down the flour. Never closed its doors because the bag had holes. Because out here, food wasn't about perfection. It was about persistence, even if that meant sharing with things that didn't pay. Once, a man swore he bit into a biscuit and felt something crunch. That wasn't bread. He stood up, spit it into his hand, and stared at it for a long time. Then he swallowed the rest because hunger overruled horror. And the taste of shame faded faster than the ache of an empty belly. The cook said nothing. Just made the next batch smaller, tighter, less likely to invite guests. Sometimes he laid traps. Little wooden boxes with metal teeth, baited with pork fat and prayer. He never checked them. Just set them by instinct and let the night do what it would, and when the traps worked, he tossed the bodies into the fire. Didn't blink. Didn't pause. Ashes don't eat. That was the rule. The flour kept coming, kept getting used. And the biscuits somehow kept getting made. They fed the weary, the drunk, the dying, and no one tasted the risk. Only the salt, only the smoke, only the warmth that came from something solid on a tin plate. Out here, food was a gamble. Every bite, a bet against spoil, against rot, against teeth in the sack, but you rolled the dice anyway. Because the alternative was nothing, and nothing didn't keep you alive. So you chewed, you swallowed, you hoped, and when the meal was over, and the cook folded the top of the sack closed again, he did so with the care of a man sealing something sacred, even if it was cracked, even if it was crawling, because in the Wild West, even the rats knew flour was life. There were meals that made sense. Beans, biscuits, bread too hard to bend. Pork that squealed with salt, and soup that came in shades of beige, but once in a while, something showed up on a plate that made the room pause. Not because it smelled bad, not because it looked wrong, but because it didn't look like anything at all. A shape, a color, a pile. Steam rising, slow and uncertain, as if even the heat didn't know it was warming. No1 asked. No one named it, because once something has a name, you have to accept what it is. And out here, mystery sometimes tasted better than truth. The cook would serve it the same as anything else. Ladle, plate, slide. Not a word spoken. No warnings. No guarantees. Just a nod, as if to say, eat it or don't. Most did, because hunger doesn't wait for clarity. And flavor, when you're tired, is just a suggestion. It could have been meat, could have been beans mashed into surrender, could have been yesterday's meal, blended and reborn with a sprinkle of ash and a touch of new regret. The texture changed from bite to bite. Sometimes stringy, sometimes smooth. Sometimes it fought the fork. Sometimes it slumped. No two bowls were the same, even side by side, and still they ate, because when something shows up hot and heavy in front of you, you don't ask it where it's been. You just thank it for arriving. One joked. Not loudly. Not the way they joked about hardtack or whiskey. These dishes, these unnamed piles, carried something sacred. A silence. You could see it in the way men ate them. Staring down. Brow furrowed. Spoon held like a compass that had lost its needle. A few bites in, and the questions vanished. Replaced by warmth. By weight. By a full stomach and a tongue too. Coated in salt and smoke to care anymore. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Sometimes the food made you sweat. Not from heat, there was none, but from uncertainty. From taste that hinted at too many stories and not enough ingredients. Still, no one got sick. Not that you heard. The cook had a way. He could boil the truth out of almost anything. Add enough. Grease and bitterness, and the thing on the plate stopped being a problem and started being a possibility. One man once said it reminded him of his mother's cooking. Then paused. Then didn't explain what he meant. And no one asked him to. There were rumors that the cook had a stash. A hidden pantry of things best not spoken of. Cans with no labels. Meat from animals not commonly eaten. Jars of pickled things. With eyes, but no one saw it. And no one cared, because on the nights when that dish appeared, the room got quiet. The chewing slowed. The faces softened. It wasn't joy, but it was. Something else, a reminder that food didn't need to be understood. Just present. Just warm. Just willing to stay in your belly when the cold tried to creep back in. You learned to trust it. Even if you couldn't explain it. Even if you wouldn't talk about it later and afterward, when the plates were empty and the spoons left sticky on the counter, no one asked what it had been. No one said, that was good. They just leaned back, patted their stomachs, wiped their mouths on their sleeves, and sat for a while longer than usual, because something about that dish, the one with no name, filled more than the stomach. A tea filled the space that silence left behind. The cook never repeated it. Not exactly. Each appearance was different. The scent changed. The texture shifted. The look in his eyes as he stirred it, sometimes regretful, sometimes proud, but never apologetic, because whatever it was, it fed them. It helped them forget what they hadn't had that day. Helped them sleep. Helped them keep going. And in a place where survival came one bite at a time, that was enough. So they didn't name it. They didn't want to, because if you name something, you risk losing it. Or worse, expecting it to come back the same way twice. And out here, nothing ever did. There's a moment in every meal when the talking stops. Not because anyone says, be quiet. Not because the food demands reverence. But because the weight of the day finally lands, and all a man can do is chew. In the saloon, silence wasn't rare. It hung from the rafters like smoke, settled on the tables like dust, and slipped into bowls with the beans. But this kind of silence, the one that came with spoons raised and eyes lowered, was different. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't empty. It was full of everything unsaid, the sound of cutlery scraping tin, the slurp of soup, the gentle tap of a spoon against a chipped rim. These became the language of men who had run out of other things to say. No one asked about the weather. No one recalled stories from the trail. Not in that moment. They just ate, and for those few quiet minutes, they weren't cowboys or miners or runaways or thieves. They were simply tired people, hungry people, doing what their bodies asked of them. It's easy to forget how much noise lives in the mouth when you aren't talking. The soft crunch of a biscuit, the slow glide of stew against a tongue, the swallow, the sigh, the moment the spoon rests just long enough to let the flavor sink in. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Some men held their spoons like weapons, others like pens, a few like they were holding someone's hand for the last time. It wasn't about the food, though the food mattered. It was about being still, just long enough for the world to catch up. The cook understood this. He didn't clatter pans. He didn't bark orders. He moved like the floor might cry if he stepped too hard. In those minutes, he let the room breathe. The fire snapped, but only once. A chair creaked like it had something to say, then fell quiet again. A spoonful of silence could hold 100 thoughts. Regret. Relief. The way a certain kind of stew reminded you of a woman you'd never see again, or the way salt, when it lands just right, can taste like a home you've forgotten. And no one rushed. No one lingered either. They ate like they were part of the same slow song, a rhythm of mouth and hand and bowl and pause. Even the drunkest among them straightened their backs. Even the loudest took one breath, held it, and let it go without a word, because silence was safe. It didn't judge. It didn't interrupt. It just let you be full in peace. There were those who didn't understand. Visitors. Men from rail towns who came in laughing, sat down still talking, and found themselves shushed by nothing at all. They looked around, confused, waited for a nod, a cue, a barked order. It never came, but eventually they caught it, the feel of the room, the way the silence wasn't empty. It was generous, and they joined in, slowly, spoon by spoon, until they too stopped needing to be heard. One man said later, "I didn't know how tired I was until I stopped speaking." The cook, overhearing, didn't respond. He just refilled the pot, because in that spoonful of silence, everything had already been said. There was no need for thanks. The eating was thanks enough. The empty bowl, placed gently on the counter, was its own kind of prayer, and when the meal was done, they didn't leap to leave. They just sat, let the quiet soak into their bones, let it settle the dust in their minds. Some would light cigars. Others would close their eyes. One or two would whisper a name, so soft it wasn't meant for anyone to hear, and the silence held all of it, until someone pushed back their chair, and the spell was broken. Just like that, the clatter returned. The laughter, the shuffle of boots, and the rise of music. If there was someone sober enough to play, but for a little while, just a little while, the room had been still, and everyone had been known, not by their stories, but by the way they held their spoon. A tea didn't happen often. Most nights, the stew tasted like survival, like salt, smoke, and something better left unnamed. It was hot. It was filling. And that was usually enough. But one night, just once, it was more than that. A tea started like every other evening. The cook had stirred the pot without much thought. The fire popped the way it always did. The beans thickened the way they always did. A handful of chopped onion, a pinch of pepper, a scrap of meat that had sat just long enough to be brave. He hadn't done anything different. Not really. But somehow, when the first bowl was ladled and set on the counter, the air shifted, not in a big way. No one gasped. No one stood up. But when the spoon touched lips, shoulders dropped just a little deeper. Eyes closed a little longer. And a soft, wordless hum escaped from a man who hadn't spoken in 3 days. He didn't realize He'd done it. No one said anything. They just kept eating, spoon after spoon. They leaned into it. There was something familiar there, not the ingredients, but the feeling. The stew tasted like a kitchen you hadn't seen in years. Like a table with mismatched chairs, sunlight on a wood floor, a voice humming a song you never learned the words to. It tasted like warmth, not just heat. No one asked the cook what he'd done. He wouldn't have answered anyway. He just kept ladling, expression flat, as if unaware of the spell he was casting. The room got quieter. Not silent, but softer. Even the card game paused. A hand hung mid-deal, a coin left unflipped, because suddenly no one wanted to leave the table. It was like the food had called something forward, a memory not of one home, but of the idea of home. The one everyone carried, but never spoke about. The one with warmth and softness, and someone who waited for you to come back inside. Men who never slowed down began to eat slower, chewing each bite like it held a story. Like if they didn't rush, they could stay in that moment a little longer. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Someone whispered, "This tastes like my ma's stew." Another nodded, though he didn't say what it reminded him of. Just wiped the corner of his eye and reached for more bread. The stew didn't last long. It never did, but this time, every bowl was scraped clean. Every bite was taken. Even the edge of the pot crust, usually left behind, was devoured with reverence, and when it was gone, they didn't clap, didn't cheer, didn't ask for more. They just sat, let the warmth settle. Some leaned back with hands folded over their stomachs. Some folded their arms on the table and let their heads rest there. One man took off his hat, laid it beside his bowl, and stared at nothing for a long time. The cook cleaned up slowly. Not rushed, not bored, just gently, as if even he didn't want the moment to end too fast. He didn't smile. But there was something softer in the way he moved, the way he wiped down the counter, the way he stirred what little remained in the pot, as if hoping there might still be one last spoonful left for someone who needed it. Outside, the wind howled like it always did. The night was sharp, the stars indifferent, but inside the saloon, there was a kind of hush, a kind of glow, as if the walls themselves had exhaled. Because sometimes the right bite at the right time can undo a little bit of what the world's done to you. And that stew, that one strange, perfect pot, did just the dot. It didn't fix anyone, didn't change the town, didn't make the food any better the next day. But for a few hours, a group of tired men felt like boys again. Hungry, yes, but not alone, not forgotten, just fed and full, and held by something they didn't have a name for. And maybe that's what home is. Not a place, not a person, but a moment when the food is warm, the room is quiet, and you forget just how cold the world really is. There was always one left, not because no one wanted it, not because it had gone bad, though it probably had, but because some things aren't meant to be eaten. Not really. The last biscuit on the table, hard, pale, cracked at the edges like an old boot sole, left behind not by accident, but by silent agreement. Every evening, as plates were cleared and chairs scraped back, there it was sitting quiet and alone in the center of the table, a little heavier than it looked, a little sadder too, sometimes. It had company, a smear of beans, a few crumbs, a spoon someone forgot to reclaim, but mostly it was alone, round, dense, unmoving, and no one touched it, not the hungry, not the drunk, not even the cook, who could have tossed it out or fed it to the stove like kindling. He left it, just like the men who left their pasts behind, just like the dog that once curled by the door and vanished with the snow. It was a kind of ritual, unspoken, unremarked, sacred, in the way things become sacred by staying still. In a world where everything was used, broken, consumed, that biscuit endured. Someone might glance at it, think about taking it. A hand might hover, but never land. It wasn't superstition. Not exactly, more like respect, or fear, or both, because the last biscuit had weight. The weight of everything they hadn't said, everything they'd left behind, everything they wanted once and couldn't name anymore. Sometimes it was made, fresh that day. Other times, it had been on that plate since Tuesday. No one knew. No one asked. It grew harder overnight, curled in on itself a little, absorbed the silence of the room like bread absorbs soup slowly, deeply, until it became part of it. It didn't mold, didn't rot. It just was. The cook didn't serve it. He didn't pretend it wasn't there. He cleaned around it, wiped the table, swept the crumbs, but the biscuit stayed. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. One man, new in town, reached for it once. There was no outcry, no scolding, just a quiet collective shift, a pause and chewing, a glance from the cook that didn't hold anger, just disappointment. The man set it down, didn't finish his drink, didn't come back. After that, no one else tried. The regulars didn't talk about it, didn't nod toward it or toast in its direction. They just knew. It had become something else, a memory baked into form, a placeholder for all the things they couldn't say, a reminder that not every hunger can be fed. Sometimes after everyone had gone, the cook would look at it, just for a moment, hands on the counter, face unreadable. Then he'd blow out the candles, turn down the lamps, leave it sitting there in the dark, and in the morning, when the fire was rekindled and the beans reheated, the biscuit would still be there. Just a little harder, just a little quieter. Some nights, it would be replaced, not eaten, just rotated out. A fresh one put in its place, the old one broken apart and crumbled into the fire, dust to dust, crumb to crumb. It was a cycle no one discussed, but everyone honored, and in that biscuit, in its stillness, its small, persistent presence, was something the men didn't have words for. Loss, maybe. Love, maybe. The ache of remembering something sweet and knowing you no longer have the teeth for it, but still you leave it. You let it sit. You recognize that not everything must be consumed. Some things are meant to linger, to remind, to rest. And so, each night, as the saloon emptied and boots faded down dirt streets and the wind crept through the cracks in the walls, the biscuit stayed, the last one, the quiet one, waiting. Not for someone to take it, but simply to be left alone, because in the Wild West, where food meant survival, and survival often meant forgetting that biscuit was memory, stale, still, and sacred. It wasn't the flavor. You remembered. Not really. Not the salt or the smoke, not the half-burned crust of bread or the sour heat of the stew. Those things passed through you, filled the belly, numbed the tongue, and were gone by morning. What stayed was something quieter, something deeper, the taste of survival. It didn't come from a single dish. Not the beans or the biscuits, not the bitter coffee or the soup that changed faces every day. It came from the hands that stirred the pot, the quiet nod of the cook who never asked for thanks, the way men shared space at a table without needing. Words. It came from the first breath after a hot meal, when your ribs stopped aching just long enough to remember you were still alive. Out here, food wasn't about pleasure. It was about presence, about making it to the next night. about the comfort of routine in a world that changed shape every time the wind shifted. You learned to love things not because they were good, but because they stayed: a tin cup of soup, a slice of pork fat, bread that didn't break your teeth,